I'm Benjamin Hall, and I'm searching for heroes. Today on Searching for Heroes, we're joined by a man who has redefined, in many senses, what it means to forgive. Azim Khamisa's life changed forever in 1995 when his only son, Tariq, was senselessly murdered while delivering pizzas. Shot and killed by a 14-year-old gang member in a brutal initiation rite. But instead of succumbing to hatred or despair, Azim made a choice that stunned the world. He forgave the boy who killed his son. And more than that, he reached out to the boy's grandfather, Ples Felix, and together they began a lifelong mission to end youth violence. Through the Tariq Khamisa Foundation, Azim has brought programs on non-violence, empathy, and emotional resilience to hundreds of schools, reaching over 1 million children. His story has inspired audiences from inner-city classrooms right to the United Nations. But this is not just a story about tragedy and loss. It's a story also about spiritual coverage, about radical accountability, and about how one man's act of forgiveness became a movement that is transforming lives. Azim, it's an honor to have you on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Ben.
I wanted to start off, and I want to talk largely about the theme of forgiveness, but I wondered if you could set the scene and just take us back to the day that you lost your son, Tariq, and what you remember about that time, and I suppose how that shifted your world.
Yes, it was 30 years ago, 1995, but it is something that never leaves you. I don't know what is more complex for a parent than to lose a child. As I said, there is not a day that I don't think of Tariq several times a day, even 30 years later. Had I been at the scene, I would intuitively put my body between him and the bullet. I think as parents, we would all do that. And when I got the call from homicide to tell me that Tariq had been shot and killed, my knee-jerk reaction was, that cannot be true. I thought it was a mistaken identity, which does happen often, because he was a good kid. He was a student at San Diego State University. He was a talented photographer and a brilliant writer, and inspired someday to work for National Geographic. He loved to travel, loved cultures. And he was a sophomore student at San Diego State and worked as a pizza delivery man on weekends to make extra money while he was in college. So I quickly hung up on homicide and called his home. He had just moved in with his girlfriend, Jennifer. They had met in university, had been dating for 2 years and got engaged, fully expecting him to pick up the phone. Back then, you didn't have mobile phones. Of course, he didn't. Jennifer did. And she couldn't say anything. She was just sobbing because homicide had gone to their home first, so she already knew. And that's when it hit. I remember I was in my kitchen. I lost strength in both of my legs as I collapsed to the floor, hit my head against the refrigerator, curled up in a ball, and the pain was so excruciating. I remember I couldn't really be in my body anymore, and I left my body. And I believe in God. I believe I went into a loving embrace of God. I grew up in the Sufi faith. Sufis are a metaphysical interpretation of Islam. And my mom was very spiritual. My father was a businessman. So I grew up with equal emphasis on my spirituality and as my career. And frankly, without that spiritual foundation, I wouldn't be here today, or would have reacted in the manner that I did. It was my spiritual foundation that helped me get through this tragedy. And I don't remember how long I was gone for. It felt like a long time. And when the explosion subsided, God sent me back into my body with the wisdom that there are victims at both ends of the gun. Now, that did not come from my mortal mind or my loving heart. It was a download from a higher power. I really did not understand the significance of it. And Tariq was shot in a very random event by a 14-year-old gang member and gang initiation in the United States. We have a lot of challenges with youth gangs all across the country, whether it's urban or suburban. Youth gangs are very prevalent in most all communities, and they have an initiation rituals. And this was a initiation for a 14-year-old to prove himself that he was worthy to be a gang member. And he was 14 years old. And 9 months after Tariq died, having learned this horrific statistics, and of course to honor Tariq, for me and my family, I felt I needed to do something. I'm a naturalized American citizen, and this download I got that there are victims at both ends of the gun probably was the first time that statement was made in America. Because what I saw in this tragedy is that, sure, Tariq was a victim of Tony, but Tony was a victim of society, of American society. I felt I should take my share of the responsibility for the bullet that took my son's life. Why? Because it was fired by an American child. You could take the position, he killed my one and only son, he should be hung from the highest pole. How does that make a better society? So somehow in my heart or my soul, I felt compassion for the young man who took Tariq's life. And I saw him as a victim of American society. I felt also as an American citizen that there wasn't enough being done to save young people like my son from death, or young people that were sent to prison for 25 to life. I felt like I lost 2 children on that day.
We'll be right back after this. It's amazing that meditation you had where you knew that there were victims at both ends of the gun. That happened immediately after you heard from homicide. There was never a moment of anger, a desire for justice. That was sort of bypassed. You went straight there on the kitchen floor to that realization. I mean, that's amazing, because that's only comes, I think, you would say, from spirituality.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, it was immediate, like you mentioned, Ben. After making some excruciating calls to Tariq's mother, I live in the San Diego area. She lived in Seattle, Washington. Calling my daughter, fortunately, Tariq wasn't my only child. In the last 30 years, I've met many that have lost an only child, which have been much harder. And call my parents. I called my best friend. He said, don't do anything. Kit and I, his name is Dan, he says, Kit and I will be there. And Kit is his wife that went to get Jennifer because she was by herself. Her family, her father was a dentist in the Navy and lived in Hawaii. And I was alone with my best friend. And he said, whoever these kids are that killed Tariq, I hope they fry in hell. And I looked at him and I said, I don't feel that way. What I see here is that there are victims at both ends of the gun. And I remember he broke down and cried, and he said, Azim, where do you get the strength? If somebody had killed Adam, which was his son, not only would I want the killer, I'd want the whole clan. I never went there. And I think, as you pointed out, that it was a download from my higher power. It was a download from my maker. And I think that when you think about us as human beings, we are also spiritual beings. Sure, we are human beings in a spiritual form, but we are also spiritual beings in a human form. And this compassion is the natural quality of the spirit. The Spirit is patient. The Spirit is compassionate. The Spirit is loving. The Spirit is forgiving. And I used to meditate an hour a day when Tariq was alive. Today, my practice is 2 hours.
I wonder, first of all, what you think about the justice, and do people have to be held to account? And did you understand that someone who commits a crime like that does need to be held accountable, does need to go to prison?
Right. No, I definitely think that you have to have accountability. Tony was sentenced to 25 years to life. And my feeling about justice is to be restorative and not to be punitive. I've written a lot about restorative justice. The punitive system in America was inherited from Great Britain and from monarchies, because in the monarchies, like in England, where you are, the king or the queen owns the land and the people. So when there is a crime committed, it is always against the king or the queen. In America, we don't have a monarchy, so the state takes that role. So in my tragedy, it was the state of California against Tony Hicks. In any altercation or crime, there are 3 parties. There's the victim, there's the offender, and then there's community. And in their format, justice is not done till 3 things happen. First, you've got to make the victim whole. Well, you can't bring Tariq back. We're working with Tony's grandfather, and now Tony has joined us. Less kids are ending up dead, like Tariq, or ending up in prison, like he served 25 years. So to the extent that I can be restored and my family can be restored, I believe we have. The second piece is you have to bring back the offender into society as a contributing and a functioning member, which we have done with Tony. He's now on the board of the foundation I created in my son's name, and he's very passionate about making sure that the kids don't follow in his former footsteps. And in the 30 years that we've been doing this work, we've reached actually over 2 million kids. And we are totally changing their trajectory. The third part is to heal the community. And for us to doing programs in schools, teaching accountability, empathy, compassion, forgiveness, and peace building, we are healing the community. So it is a much better form of justice than the punitive system where you throw them in a cell and throw the key away.
It's interesting you mentioned meeting Tony, and obviously he's working alongside you now, but that first time that you must have met him, looked in his eyes, what was that like, and what did you say to him? And what did he say to you?
Right. Yeah, so that happened 5 years after the tragedy. So he was 19 years old. It took several thousand hours of meditation to have enough fortitude to go visit him. But I started the foundation and soon reached out to his grandfather. So I'd been with the grandfather for a good 4 years. And he kept me abreast of Tony because he was always involved in Tony's life. Tony lived with his grandfather, so he was his guardian as well. And Tony calls his grandfather Daddy. And I asked the grandfather to reach out to Tony, and he wasn't quite ready. So, Ples, which is the grandfather, told me Tony's not quite ready. But it didn't take him very long. It took him about 6 months after I asked to meet him. And I asked Ples to go with me because this was the first time, because I wanted to have him introduce me. But then I also told Ples that I need some alone time with Tony because I have some tough questions for him. And Ples was very graceful. So we spent the first 15, 20 minutes together, and then he left me and Tony alone, and we spent a couple hours talking man to man, and he answered my questions. But the seminal moment in that meeting was we locked eyeballs. I'm looking in his eyes, and he's looking in my eyes. And we held that glance for what seemed like almost an uncomfortable time. And I'm looking in his eyes trying to find a murderer, and I didn't. He was articulate. He was well-mannered. He was remorseful. He was well-spoken. And he didn't portray any of the typical attitudes of a 19-year-old gang member in American culture. I wasn't expecting that. I was able to climb through his eyes and touch his soul, that I got that the spark in him was no different than the spark in me or you or anyone else who is listening to this interview. And I felt that at that level of spirituality, a oneness with Tony. I wasn't expecting that. He was a likable kid. I could tell that my hand of forgiveness had shifted him to be the person he was at 19, not the person he was when he took Tariq's life. And at that point, I told him, you know that I have forgiven you because I've been with your grandfather for a good 4 years. But I want to let you know that when you come out of prison, we will have a job waiting for you at the Azim Khamisa Foundation. And he asked for my forgiveness. He answered my questions. And as I left the prison, he's 43 years now. He's 43 years old now. I still remembered, although it was many years ago, that my cadence leaving the prison was a lot more bouncier than the one I walked in with. Because at that point, I knew that I had completed my journey of forgiveness. And one of the things that I wish people would understand more, that forgiveness is something you do for yourself. The fact that it can impact the offender is actually the icing on the cake. Because if you stay in anger, if you stay in resentment, if you stay in hatred or shame or guilt, who are you really hurting? There's a great quote from Nelson Mandela that unforgiveness is like drinking poison and waiting for your enemy to die. It eventually will kill you. So that meeting with Tony was another blessing. Of course, I had a blessing, similar blessing, when I met the grandfather, also a very spiritual man, same age as I am, very intelligent, master's degree in urban development, had a good home for Tony, one of the smartest and the most wisest persons I know. We're like brothers. But then this was another blessing when I met Tony, because forgiveness really is a journey. It's not an event. It's like peeling back an onion. There are many layers of it. And I stayed with Tony for 20 more years. From 19 to 39, we communicated every month by letters, advocating for his release. Finally, in 2019, he went in front of the parole board. And I was there advocating for his release. And even the commissioner was in tears. He says, Mr. Khamisa, I've done this for 25 plus years. I've never had the victim's father advocate for the offender's release. I said, he's got work to do. He has work to do, not behind bars. I will guarantee his behavior. We'll hire him in the foundation, release him, because he can save many other young people that might be thinking about joining gangs. He joined a gang in 6th grade at the age of 11. He took my son's life in 8th grade at the age of 14. And I said, you know how big this problem is in the United States. So release him. Because Tony, normally in American system, you don't get parole the first time you go in front of a parole board. Sometimes you never get parole. But he was released on his first parole hearing. It was a 7-hour grilling. It was a very difficult parole hearing. My daughter who runs the foundation was there. He cried a lot. We all cried a lot because it's very easy to get into altercations in the prison system. You can look at an officer in the prison system the wrong way, and you're punished. So it's very easy to have altercations. And of course, Tony had a few while he was in prison. So they grilled him on every one of them. But eventually, he did win parole. So he came out in 2019, which is 6 years ago. Now he's volunteering for the foundation. He works as a plumber at a company which supports the foundation. They gave him a job, which is very hard for homicide to get a job, but they know the foundation, and he's been promoted 3 times. He's picked up on, he had to learn how to drive and learn about technology, and he's better at technology than I am. He's picked it up pretty quickly. And if you met him, you wouldn't have a clue that he spent 25 years in prison. And he's so passionate about helping other kids, and he's now going to start this coming semester to a course in restorative justice. So
you said there that forgiveness is a journey, that there are many different levels to it. Explain to me what that journey looked like.
Yeah, so the journey, the journey has several major steps, but I'll share with you. The first step is to grieve. Grieving is medicine. There's a good adage from the Turkish culture that he who conceals his grief does not find a remedy for it. Now, there are healthy ways to grieve, and then there are unhealthy ways to grieve. Obviously, we all know what the unhealthy ways are. The healthy ways, and it took me a good 3.5 years in the grieving space, is you journal, you pray, you read something inspirational and meditate, you spend time with nature, you self-care, and it's the painful part of going through before you can get to forgiveness. You probably know a book called The Prophet by Khalil Gibran. It's a great chapter in there about joy and sorrow. And what Gibran says, when you are feeling sorrow, joy is sleeping on your bed. And when you are feeling joy, sorrow is sleeping on your bed, because you feel joy and sorrow with the same faculty. And he gives this example of a potter that's making this beautiful sculpture from clay. And he's so into the sculpture that as he's shaping this masterpiece, he wets the sculpture with his tears. Once the sculpture is ready, he has to put that in a 2300 Fahrenheit degree oven over 24 hours so the clay can become porcelain and radiate its beauty. I know what it feels like to be in the 2300 degree Fahrenheit oven. And it depends on the nature of the event. Obviously, losing a son probably is way high up there. But there are many issues that we go through life between birth and death, divorce, illnesses, losing some loved one. So the grieving part we've lost as a culture. One of my books is called The Secrets of the Bulletproof Spirit, How to Bounce Back from Life's Hardest Hits. I have 30 chapters in it that helps you essentially learn the forgiveness process. The second part, once you have finished grieving, is to give up all the resulting resentment. And the tools to do that is to develop your empathy muscle and to set the intention. Because as I said, forgiveness is the fruit of the Spirit. And in your meditation, if you set the intention to forgive with no strings attached, that you really want to forgive whoever that is that has harmed you, you want to bless them and let them go on their way, and you want to bless yourself. And intentions are very powerful. Wayne Dyer, who is another famous spiritual author, he passed away, I knew him, we spoke together, wrote a book called The Power of Intentions. And I also teach how you build your empathy muscle. And if you continue to practice building your empathy muscle and setting this intention, because at the end of the day, forgiveness is a blessing. And what is a blessing? A blessing is when preparation meets grace. And just like I was blessed with the grace of forgiveness, so can anybody. Unless the important thing is to practice the process.
We'll be right back after this. When we talk about religion. I don't know as much about Sufi as I would like, but in Christianity, you have good and evil. You have heaven and hell. You have the stories of Sodom and Gomorrah, where two towns were totally destroyed. So it's interesting about forgiveness because even the Bible has some cases where too much evil has been committed and they are not forgiven. So, where do you stand on that division?
Well, I think Christianity probably has an equal example of forgiveness. Father, forgive them because they do not know what they are doing. This is Lord Jesus Christ as they're crucifying him. This is a pretty central message of forgiveness. I think all religions have it. I think at the end of the day, I think we all have to learn forgiveness, especially if you want to get to peace. I personally feel, having done this work in prison, that I don't believe there is evil. I believe that every soul has something of value buried within them. I've yet to meet an offender that was not a victim. Hurt people. And I've done 30 years of work in prisons. I've met many of these individual carcerations. When you hear their stories, and Tony's no different. He was a young person, was abused as a child. So I think that whole piece about creating empathy is important because it's difficult to have empathy for somebody you don't know.
Yeah.
You can hear stories about it, but I know everything there is to know about Tony. And frankly, if I had grown up just like he did, I would have done the same thing because the pizza delivery man was nobody to him. He was under the order from the gang leader, busting Bones. Bones was his gang nickname, and he fired a bullet. So this was an angry kid that was an abused kid that was sent to live with his grandfather at a very young age and joined a gang at 11, which he thought was his family. So when you look and say, what has society done to not address these young people that are being abused? So to judge, and another thing I learned from His Holiness is that one of the biggest impediment to forgiveness is judging. We're so quick to judge based on all the isms. And the one thing I think if people can get from this interview that are listening to it is to not judge. Even the scriptures tell you, leave judgment to me. And in the Sufi faith, it's the same thing. The day of judgment is not up to you, it's up to God. So if you can rid yourself of judgment, you'll start building your empathy muscle much more quicker.
I suppose that comes from community and perhaps it comes from spirituality as well. So those three things, perhaps the next generation, if it has those, maybe they can take on defeat.
Yeah, when I started the foundation, I started with the simple premise that violence is a learned behavior. Child is born violent. Tony wasn't born violent. And if you accept that as a truism or as an axiom, then nonviolence can also be a learned behavior. But you have to teach it. As you pointed out, it's about education. And that's what we do in the foundation.
Well, gosh, what a pleasure to speak with you, Azim. I really, really appreciate it. And I know that you're someone who, there's no easy solution. It's not going to happen straight away. But if just more people just start doing a little bit, if more people start thinking about it, if more people start educating, then we've always got to have that hope that we can get there. Absolutely.
It was a right choice for me. And I think that the fruits of forgiveness, when I wrote my first book, which was 3 years after the tragedy, there wasn't much out there on forgiveness. Today, there are over 500 clinical studies. There's a forgiveness project at Stanford run by a good friend of mine that clinically proves that forgiveness is good for your health, for your happiness, for finding peace. So hopefully many of the people that listen to this interview can hopefully become not only forgiving, but try and get more people to share so that someday, hopefully, we do have a peaceful and a compassionate world.
I hope so. Well, you're certainly a model for all of them. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. And thank you for all the good that you're doing.
Thanks for having me, Ben.
Well, what a start I think that was to our theme of forgiveness. And honestly, there are conversations that you will carry with you for a long, long time. And for me, that was one of them. I think what Azim shared with us today wasn't just a story about forgiveness itself. I think it was effectively a masterclass in what it can mean to forgive. And more importantly, it was about how forgiving, as difficult, painful, hard as it can be used to become a force for deep and lasting change. That's what Azim has done. That's how he's used forgiveness. I think so often we talk about forgiveness as a final step. It's what we work towards when something traumatic has happened. It's a moral or even a spiritual achievement. But what I found so surprising today, and frankly very moving, was how Azim described it as a journey rather than somewhere you have to get to. And for Azim, it was a journey with grief at its center. And more importantly, it was a journey with discipline and with intention and with spiritual work as well, in his case. And I think those two things, discipline and intention, are again the two things that you need to get through anything traumatic. You have to work hard to get through it. You have to know where you want to go, and you have to keep working to get there. And as Azim said today, forgiveness is a perfect example of when you have to use those powers. And I was struck really as well about his initial reaction to the loss of Tarek, his son. That even in that moment of unimaginable pain, when he was collapsed on the kitchen floor, he didn't feel anger, rage, no vengeance, but amazingly, he felt compassion. That is something I'm not sure I can quite understand. You know, his insight, and in his words, he said, there are victims at both ends of the gun. For me, that is almost impossible to imagine. I get the idea, but I don't know how you could feel that in that moment when you hear such devastating news. And yet, it happened to Azim. And from feeling that, this movement that he has grown was born. And I think maybe what I would take out of that is that the idea alone, that idea, it reshapes perhaps how we might think about justice and about punishment. Because he didn't say that the boy who killed his son didn't deserve consequences. He thought that the consequences should be restorative, that you don't throw people away even when they've done the unthinkable. You ask instead, how did this happen? How did we fail this child before he picked up a gun? And again, that's incredibly powerful, but I'm not quite certain I can understand or reach that position. Part of me feels when you have done something so tragic, so cruel, maybe you don't deserve to have a place in society anymore. Is that part of the social act? You know, I don't have an answer to this, but I want you guys to think about that. Can you really forget something so terrible when someone has done it? Do you believe in the idea of evil and good? And is everything evil come from a lack of society providing it? So I don't know, maybe that leads into the heart of what we're talking about the current theme of forgiveness. What causes the crimes to be committed? And if it's not the person who commits them, can we forgive them? So we've explored a lot of different angles, and we're going to continue doing that in this theme of forgiveness. But I think what Azim brought today is that forgiveness doesn't have to be sentimental. It is grounded in spiritual strength, but it's also, in Azim's eyes, it's a clear-eyed understanding of trauma, responsibility, and society. He would say it's not about forgetting, it's about transforming. That's what forgiveness is about. It's about moving forward and transforming, not forgetting what happened. And maybe what surprised me most is this. He said forgiveness can be an act of self-preservation. It can be the most practical thing. Yes, as Azim said, his phrase, he said, staying in anger is like drinking poison and waiting for your enemy to die. And I think that was amazing. So I think it's easy sometimes to fall into despair when things happen. You look at the violence, the divisions, the injustices around us. But what I took today, And what Azim shows is that forgiveness isn't passive. It's a form in his eyes of resistance, and it can be powerful enough to change lives. And certainly, Azim has changed the lives of millions of people by going out and talking about his forgiveness and how he forgave the person who killed his only son. So, as we continue this series on forgiveness, I want you to sit with this story for a moment, think about it. Maybe let it unsettle you. Certainly it unsettles me in a bit because I'm not sure I quite understand the way in which he was able to forgive something so drastic. But I hope that this theme challenges your ideas about justice and healing and maybe what is possible. So, again, thank you so much for listening. I hope that you got something from today's podcast, and I hope it gives you a moment to think about what you think forgiveness is about. And I suppose if you're holding on to something, whether it's anger or grief, maybe it's a reminder that forgiveness isn't something you give to someone else, something you give to yourself, and perhaps it's something you give to society. So get in touch. Let me know what you think. And I hope you enjoyed our guest today. Thank you. Thanks for listening to Searching for Heroes. Listen ad-free with a Fox News Podcasts Plus subscription on Apple Podcasts. And Amazon Prime members can listen to this show ad-free on the Amazon Music app.